Instruction in youth is like engraving in stone. Moroccan proverb. I am a deep sea scuba diver. My love of the sea started when I was young. I grew up in a mostly black middle class neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan. In the evenings, I would sit in the living room watching Sea Hunt, an underwater adventure television program that aired when I was a boy in the late 1950s and early 60s. I enjoyed Sea Hunt because it was unlike anything I had ever seen. It featured ocean exploration and sunken ships and treasure. And I decided right then that I too would one day explore shipwrecks in distant oceans. There was just one problem. Little boys from Detroit didn't know much about scuba diving. I was the only kid in my neighborhood who talked about diving, and I never missed an episode of this television show. My friends played basketball, football, and baseball. I enjoyed playing sports too, but I yearned for travel and adventure. For me, Sea Hunt was an escape of sorts, something to help me cope with the atmosphere surrounding the violent civil rights marches and demonstrations that were happening in Detroit at the time. I didn't know how to swim, but luckily my mother was not only supportive, she was also an excellent swimmer. She took me to the local pool, and in the protective shallow end, she taught me the front crawl and the breaststroke. Eventually, she felt I was ready to master the deep end of the pool. I wasn't so sure. As I stood tentatively at the edge of the pool, looking into 10 terrifying feet of water, without warning, she pushed me in. I wish I could say that I swam around the pool with the grace of a delicate swan, but no. I sputtered and flailed to the side of the pool and clutched the cold tile as if it were a lifeline, gaping at my mom and her sly smile. But then my heart stopped racing. I looked back at the water and took a deep breath. I slipped under the surface and swam the entire length of the pool for the very first time. My mom told me how proud she was, and we drove home laughing about my first experience in the deep. I've been swimming ever since. This is a story about how my love of swimming and later deep sea diving led me on a journey to 3 continents as I helped uncover the mystery surrounding a little-known 17th century shipwreck. It's about how I, along with others, pieced together a 300-year-old transatlantic puzzle that would teach me about myself and where I came from. But more than that, it's the untold story of millions of African people taken as captives to the New World, whose names and faces have been erased and eradicated by time, distance, and history. A friend is someone you share the path with. African proverb. This is where I enter the story. It was 1992 and I was in Key West, Florida to attend a conference for the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, an organization founded the year before by Dr. Jose Doc Jones, a world-renowned marine biologist and celebrated underwater explorer. I was a newspaper reporter, but I had grown up and finally learned to dive. I had become an avid scuba diver, in fact. And that spring, I'd received a newsletter from the National Association of Black Scuba Divers announcing plans to dive over a slave ship. Doc was sitting alone in the corner of a conference hotel scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad and watching his dream of a black scuba diving organization become a reality as black people from coast to coast began to check in at the hotel's front desk. Why did Doc decide to establish a black scuba diving organization, you might ask? Well, scuba diving can be a risky sport, and it's incredibly important for scuba divers to be able to rely on their dive buddies underwater. Your life might just depend on it. Over the years, some black scuba divers have been dismissed because of the color of their skin. It happened to me in Florida about 20 years ago, when a white diver refused to dive with me because he assumed, since I was black, that I didn't have any diving experience, and then I would jeopardize his safety underwater. Honestly, that made me worry that he would jeopardize my safety underwater. After getting the newsletter from the National Association of the Black Scuba Divers, I decided to join. The weird part I discovered later was that apparently I wasn't actually on the list of newsletter recipients, and no one was sure how I happened to receive the newsletter. At the hotel in Key West, Doc invited me to pull up a chair and join him, and we talked for 2 hours. He told me about his vision for bringing black divers together, and he was passionate about sharing the news about the slave ship. He was excited that I was a journalist and hoped I might help tell the story of this ship. It's an interesting coincidence that this slave ship has come to our attention at a time when we're forming a national organization of black scuba divers, Doc said. Doc talked about the possibility of being able to lay some sort of underwater memorial at the site of the Henrietta Marie. I couldn't wait to be a part of this historic slave ship pilgrimage. The Henrietta Marie has always taken a back seat to the wreck of the Atocha. The treasure that was found in that wreck fired up people's imaginations, but the artifacts from the Henrietta Marie were just stuck in a corner in the museum, David said. As an archaeologist, he said, I attempted to view the site as objectively and scientifically as possible. But when you look at those shackles, what that ship was doing, her objective, really hits home. Those shackles haven't been handled by more than 1 or 2 people since they were worn by slaves. Also recovered from the Henrietta Marie were thousands of glass beads. Some of them, the ones with large stripes, were called gooseberries. The tiny glass beads were made in Venice, Italy, and they were a variety of colors: dark blue, bright yellow, turquoise, green, and white. They were undoubtedly beautiful, though they were cheap to make and cheap to buy. They became a valuable commodity to slave traders for one important reason. The beads were precious to Africans and were used to barter for African people who would be traded into slavery. Some African medicine men used the beads for healing, and artists fashioned the beads for sculptures. Some African kings strung the beads together and wore them to symbolize political and social power. Some kings adorned their bodies with so many beads that aides had to help them stand from their thrones because they were so heavy. The little beads quickly became a significant part of West African culture. As beautiful and as important as they must have been, I wondered how they could have been measured against human life. Textiles and other manufactured goods, including weapons, were also used to buy African people. But these little beads became legendary because they were so insignificant outside of the slave trade. To people today, it makes no sense. I spent my days inside the National Maritime Museum studying books about slavery. If I was going to figure out what happened with the ship, I'd have to do a lot of research. Before being in that library, I hadn't realized there were so many books about the African slave trade. Through reading countless entries from these historical books, captains' logs, and journals, I slowly came to grips with the fact that slavery, for ship captains, was simply business, nothing more. Even though I understood this concept from an intellectual perspective, it was difficult for me to read about more atrocities in the name of business every time I turned a page. As I read the journals, I was struck by what I didn't see: the word human to describe African people. Instead, there were words like beasts, savages, merchandise, creatures, pickaninnies, and cargo. Slavery was indeed an international business, but I believe it was a business based on racial injustice because the main cargo shipped to the New World was boatloads of African people. I had read that some of London's more prominent citizens were buried underneath the St. Mary Ab Church in the 17th century, many of them undoubtedly having ties to slave trade, and maybe Tournai was one of them. I finally took a deep breath and walked in. I walked through the silent church and found stairs that led to a dark hallway lined with long gray tombs along the floor and pressed into the walls. It was difficult to read the name on the crypts since they were faded by decades of dust and sediment. "May I help you?" a cleric asked. I told him I was looking for a particular crypt, and with a sudden burst of emotion, I revealed that it was not a family member. This is not a friend. The cleric said so many people had been buried beneath the church over the years that bodies were stacked on top of each other, and it would be impossible to know who was entombed here. Any record of burials, he explained, would have been lost decades ago. Angus Constam is a noted historian, author of some 70 books, who is known for his groundbreaking research on 17th century weapons, and, as we learned, for his legendary heavy foot on the gas pedal. From shipping records, David and I found out that there were 8 cannons on board the Henrietta Marie. These cannons were 6 feet long and weighed between 750 and 1,000 pounds each. The cannons had all been marked with an S. Based on his research, Angus believed that the cannons were made at a foundry or metal factory called Steam Mill, which had manufactured 450 tons of iron guns during the 17th century. We found records that the mill had been located outside the Hamburg of Chiddingly, but we didn't have anything else to go on. The only thing we had was a weathered book Angus had found in the library that had a 300-year-old black and white drawing of what the steam mill looked like in the late 1600s. It was certainly a long shot. Angus believed that the cannons were made for John Mad Jack Fuller, a local landowner who also owned a plantation in Jamaica. We speculated that the enslaved Africans from the Henrietta Marie were taken there to work in the fields. The Henrietta Marie arrived in Port Royal, Jamaica on May 17, 1700. This was the second slaving voyage for the Henrietta Marie. As I reviewed the shipping records, I saw the ship had moved on to its second captain, John Taylor, after Deacon had given up his command several months earlier. This time, after an arduous 3-month voyage from Africa to the Caribbean, there were only 190 Africans on board. 90 men, 60 women, 30 boys, and 10 girls, shacked in the cramped, foul-smelling hold beneath the ship. 2 days later, they were led off the Henrietta Marie in chains, down a gangway and into the town square of Port Royal. Some of them were branded with the letters HM to identify them as having come from the Henrietta Marie slave ship. Like in Barbados, these Africans were rounded up by European slave owners who bid on them like cattle. The men were sold for 18 pounds each, the women 16, the boys 14, and the girls 12. At the end of the year in 1700, the Henrietta Marie plotted a course back to England and sailed away from Jamaica. The route would take the ship past the Cayman Islands, around Cuba's Cape San Antonio, and across the Florida Straits, a dangerous stretch of water that slave ship captains liked to avoid. From David's research and Nigel Tatterfield's notes, I finally discovered what had happened to the Henrietta Marie. While sailing the Florida Straits, the Henrietta Marie likely collided with a ferocious hurricane that tore the wooden ship apart. The crew dropped all of the ship's anchors in a desperate attempt to ride out the storm, but the hurricane was too powerful, even for the 120-ton ship. The crew were all washed over the side of the ship and were never seen again. And all of the chains, shackles, and manacles used to restrain the African people fell hard to the ocean floor, where they rested for 300 years until they were discovered by Mo Molinar, the black treasure hunter. David and I began our research on Fuller's plantation in a long-standing archival building in Spanish Town, in the parish of St. Catherine near Kingston, where Mad Jack Fuller owned his plantation in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Spanish Town is the former capital of Jamaica, and it is far off the beaten path for tourists today. The town was established by the Spanish in 1534, but it was taken over by the British in 1655. Like most of the Caribbean, it has a long history of colonization, and it shows. There are large areas of poverty, and the city has a reputation for high crime. Guides were highly recommended, but David and I were two confident guys and decided to venture into Spanish Town alone. The archival building is a place where official records are stored. David and I had pulled onto a busy street near the library, where a dozen or more young black Jamaican men were hanging out. There was a rusty wrought iron gate that separated us from the library, and as we walked through it, the young Jamaican men out front became curious about our visit. They stared at us from the curb and asked for money. David and I continued inside, where we were greeted by a woman asking how she could help. We explained that we were looking for any information about the Fuller family from the 1600s and 1700s and the Knowles estate, which from our research we knew to be a 1,500-acre parcel of land that had once been part of Fuller's plantation and had been transformed into a rugged sugar plantation that still existed. The woman was gone for about 20 minutes and returned with 2 dusty leather-bound books and the words "Probate Records" barely visible on the front. The date on the books was 1745. David's inner archaeologist came out as he whispered to me that the books, records of wills from people who had died centuries earlier, had not been properly preserved over the years because the pages were worn. Despite that, surprisingly, the handwritten entries were still legible. I was immensely curious about this present-day property that was once owned by the Fullers. So the next day, David and I hired a driver to help us find the Knowles estate. The driver was Jamaican, had grown up near Spanish Town, and knew the area well. The Knowles estate was still listed on Jamaican maps, so we plotted our course and headed back to the shadow of Jamaica's Blue Mountains. I learned that the present-day Tulloch estate had been transformed into a banana packing farm. Once I reached the estate, I looked around at acres of Jamaican men and women, picking and packing bananas. A man driving a tractor said to me after I asked about life there, "It's been hard sometimes, but we make do." Then he told me something really extraordinary. "There's an old Jamaican family that's been around for years," he said. "They live down the road. Their name is Fuller." A family tie is like a tree. It can bend, but it cannot break. African proverb. Black Fullers. I was curious to learn about the Jamaican Fullers. In the 1700s, during slavery, it was customary for slave owners to give their last names to their African workers. These could very well be the living, breathing descendants of the Henrietta Marie slaves. So, for the first time on my journey, after all my research, travels, and studying of history books, probate records, wills, and death certificates, I felt that I was on the brink of a phenomenal discovery. As a seasoned journalist, it was important for me to conduct my research in London and Jamaica, but it was something extremely powerful to potentially meet and interview people who could be the real-life links to this long-lost ship. I knew it was unusual, but I had this strange sense that whether or not these people were actually distantly related to me, they were my family. I would never know for sure if my ancestors were aboard the Henrietta Marie, but I did know one thing. In the face of so much despair, cruelty, and sadness, these people and I were all connected because we had survived. Our people had survived. I pulled out my notebook and walked to the front porch of a small peeling clapboard house, where a black man with a mop of white hair and green eyes introduced himself as Colin Fuller and welcomed me into his home. And then he told me his story. "I was born right out back," said Mr. Fuller, pointing to the lush backyard of his modest home. Mr. Fuller said when he was 18 years old in the 1920s, he used a machete to cut sugarcane for his British bosses who owned the Tulloch estate. He said he worked 12 to 14 hours a day and was paid about 10 cents a day for his work. Over the years, he said he buried 4 brothers and 4 sisters in Bog Walk, not too far from the Tulloch estate. And even though he didn't move around very well anymore, he recalled the days of harvesting tobacco and sugarcane. Colin Fuller explained that his nephew Lachlan Fuller could fill in more gaps. Since he lived across the street, I headed there to learn more. Lachlan told me that for 30 years, he had hauled bananas from the fields on the Tulloch estate, but he felt he wasn't treated fairly and was underpaid. Even after 30 years of working on that estate, he was only paid 50 cents a day. Historians believe that the Nollis estate may have originally been as large as 5,000 acres, and Mad Jack Fuller could have likely taken Colin Fuller's ancestors from the Henrietta Marie to the Nollis estate in the 1700s. The timing made sense. As I walked off the property, I stared at the old peeling warehouse that was once used as a barracks for enslaved Africans who worked the plantation. I felt trapped in a time warp. After talking with the Jamaican Fullers, I felt like I finally had some closure. But there was still one thing I had to do.